So normally I'm very enthusiastic in a lot of my intros, but today this is going to be a very serious topic, and I wanted to give a quick disclaimer. If you guys are very sensitive to information about abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, and this thing might trigger you or it might enrage you and, set you down a spiral, please click off the video. This was a very, very hard topic film, let alone write about and research about. And honestly, it took me a while because of how disturbing the information that I found truly was. And this is just a fictional character. But I thought I would be honest and say that this is a very serious video, and so is my demeanor. But that's because something like this deserves to be taken extremely seriously. Please proceed with caution, and I will see you guys at the end of the video. But first, let us understand, what are Avoxes? Avoxes are enslaved citizens of the capital or the districts who have been punished by the capital by having their tongues removed. Alongside the punishment of having their tongues cut out, they are also condemned to becoming servants of people in the capital. They are usually punished for being so-called rebels or traitors to the capital or the capital's mission or what the capital stands for. As they are subsequently enslaved, they end up doing tasks that people in the capital, or especially the richest people in the capital, deem to be beneath them, such as maintenance or sanitation work. Avoxes are distinguishable in their white uniform, but in the film, sometimes we see them don red as well. They're also made to look somewhat very similar to each other, at least those who serve as civil servants. Others who work in different areas might probably have a different look. The first view of Avoxes that we get is actually in the first book of the Hunger Games, and also in the first film. As you can see, behind Katniss and Peeta, there are Avoxes, except this time they're forced in these strange masks of some sort. Avoxes have a more prominent place, and it's unfortunate that the films decided to remove them. I don't really know why, but then again, there are some important scenes that the film removed beforehand. I personally think these scenes should have been added to show the layers of how evil the capital was, alongside killing children and using them from sport and entertainment, segregating people and killing people for rebelling against the capital's regime. But anyways, I digress. Let's get back into it. Let's talk about their jobs or positions in the capital. Avoxes are forced to work as slaves in the capital, and as previously stated, they do tasks that the capital deems as beneath them or lower than their position. These tasks tend to include cleaning or cleaning after tributes or members of the capital, maintenance or sanitation work. Most Avoxes that we see in the film are seen waiting on tributes in the training center or waiting on tributes within their rooms or their personal living spaces. However, they tend to hold different positions. As we see in the first movie, Peeta and Katniss have Avoxes waiting on them as soon as they're in the train. They stand for hours on end, and we don't know whether they get their own time to sleep or where they get to sleep, but we do see them stand constantly awaiting and waiting on other people. While everyone is eating and getting dressed, they stand there for hours. But this is just the one part of a possible job an Avox could be forced to have. They tend to have different positions within the capital. Other Avoxes were enslaved as civil servants, which means that they would be charged to do the day-to-day maintenance of the capital. They worked shifts in the sewer network and in the transfers underneath the city, which we see in this scene in Mockingjay Part 1. Now, what is a transfer? A transfer was a special network of tunnels built underneath the capital. It was used by small trucks and cargoes to transport goods throughout the city, and it ran directly underneath the capital's above ground roads. A lot of the times it gets staffed in shifts by Avoxes. The transfer tunnels have existed for a long time, actually, as they were mentioned in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Coriolanus Snow. He himself described it as a network of tracks and roadways built underneath the capital. And when Marcus, who was a tribute from District 2 in the 10th Hunger Games, in which Coriolanus had not taken over yet, Marcus tried to escape from the capital arena using the transfer and going underground. This was later confirmed that he had been trapped in a remote level of the transfer, where he was eventually captured and then strung up for everyone to witness as punishment. This network of tunnels is where some Avoxes are forced to work. They also worked in other levels of waste management. Avoxes' working conditions were also abhorrent. There were Avoxes that worked underground that never saw sunlight and had to navigate dangerous pods every day just to do their job in the transfers, the network of tunnels underground. A pod is an obstacle or a weapon that has been designed to trap or kill anyone in the proximity of its activation. In Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2, you saw a lot of pods. Sometimes those would be essentially traps that would alert mutts to come and attack certain people, or it would be things like bombs. But for an Avox that worked on the ground, avoiding a pod every single day was the norm for their working life, besides not being able to see sunlight. Imagine working every single day, running in a specific way or walking in a specific way in an already hard job to avoid being either blown to death or torn apart to death. Another interesting thing to note is that Avoxes are also very dependent on the tribu's state and status. According to PETA in Mockingjay, the two Avoxes that served them, which we'll talk about in a second, Lavinia and eventually Darius, who served District 12's tributes during the 75th Hunger Games, were imprisoned with him in the capital. Unfortunately, because of PETA and Katniss's quote-unquote rebellion, Lavinia and Darius were tortured and killed in horrible ways. But I will elaborate on that in just a sec, such as cleaning or driving garbage trucks. Avoxes, as a result, are treated less than second-class citizens and sometimes not as human beings. So let's talk about their treatment and their abuse. A lot of the times, Avoxes, because they're essentially slaves to the capital, tend to be dehumanized. They are stripped of their identity and voice. By taking away a person's ability to speak by cutting out their tongue, not only is that an inhuman form of punishment, but it also symbolizes stripping away one's humanity and autonomy as a human being. Which is not surprising, as any institution that doesn't mind killing children for sport and entertainment, they would also do the same to adults. I think one of the reasons the capital also takes out their tongues is to also symbolize how afraid the capital was of word of mouth. You see the symbolism in multiple ways the capital uses certain techniques to keep district members apart from one another, and especially to keep the districts from banding together. In the books, you learn that a lot of districts are not fully informed about how other districts work or how many people that they are. The entertainment that is shown doesn't show the real truth of what is happening on a daily basis. By isolating each district, they are not fully aware of one another, nor their strengths and weaknesses of each individual district. So it becomes hard for people to form a network in which they could connect to one another and plan together. By blocking people from speaking, you also prevent people from spreading important information about the capital. And by instilling fear into citizens, it'll make citizens too afraid to speak up against the capital in the first place. The truth is, if we look at examples in real life, we see these kinds of regimes happening in the real world. In Afghanistan, women have now been banned from speaking in public. They haven't had their tongues cut out, but to me personally, it kind of feels that way symbolically because they've taken a simple human autonomy to be able to speak. The truth is, the more you know, the more you learn, and the more you can spread important information around. The truth is, in different parts of the world, these activities that the capital takes out on people are actively happening in our world every day. And also, my heart goes out to all the women in Afghanistan. I think it's also important to note that the Avoxes being placed in certain areas where you can see them constantly is another tactic that the capital uses. It adds another layer of trauma and fear, so you never forget what the capital can do. Yes, they may be servants to certain tributes, but by also making them tongueless, each tribute can remember what could possibly happen to them if they speak out against the capital. The presence of the Avoxes serves as a constant reminder of this, of the capital's willingness to punish any form of dissent and rebellion in their eyes. Let's talk about another form of abuse that Avoxes suffer: mutilation and experimentation. According to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes in Chapter 8, Coriolanus Snow witnessed Avoxes in the Citadel having had animal parts surgically transplanted onto certain parts of their bodies in some grotesque experiment, as well as being tortured with jabberjays that echoed their screams. The capital would use these Avoxes in carrying out their disgusting experiments on them. So essentially, since time, they've always been the capital's playthings, which is another layer of disturbing. Out of all the Avoxes that exist in the capital, we only know the name of 3: Lavinia, Pollux Henson, and Darius. So let's start with Lavinia. So Lavinia was an Avox who served Katniss Everdeen throughout the 74th and 75th Hunger Games, the first 2 films and the first 2 books. In the first book, we're fully introduced to her, and we see immediately that Katniss knows her from somewhere. It turns out that Lavinia had not always been an Avox. Lavinia and an unknown boy, whom Katniss, from her point of view, thought was either her brother or her lover, were seen by Katniss and Gale while they were out hunting in the woods outside of District 12. It seemed that Lavinia and this boy were trying to escape from the capital into District 13. The reasons? We never know why. Katniss did note from her perspective that the two had a capital look to them. So that suggests that they were not from the districts, which makes you wonder why they were running away, since members of the capital seem to have more privilege than those of the districts. Regardless, a capital hovercraft shot down the boy with a spear and instantly killed him, but Lavinia was taken up by that same hovercraft. And eventually, when Katniss becomes a tribute, Katniss sees Lavinia and recognizes her, but at this time, she had become an Avox for quote-unquote committing crimes against the capital. This is the first introduction we get into seeing an Avox, and another horrendous, sad story in which the capital notoriously abuses whoever they are, even if the young people are capital members themselves. It's also interesting that in this chapter, Katniss is not necessarily allowed to express that she knows this Avox. She seems to recognize Lavinia. It seems that her and the rest of the team were immediately worried as to why she knew an Avox. I think it's interesting that since these people would be involved in the rebellion, they would be immediately hesitant for Katniss to be associated or aware of who this Avox is. Another thing we learned from this chapter is that Avoxes cannot publicly acknowledge anything that was not a direct order. So when Katniss tries to have a conversation with her in chapter 6, the attempt at the conversation was ignored. However, when Katniss gets angry and she makes a mess in her room prior to her interview night, it's Lavinia that helps her clean up. Katniss feels a lot of guilt because she thinks to herself that perhaps if her and Gale had saved Lavinia, she would have not been an Avox. But the truth is, if Katniss and Gale had saved Lavinia, they probably would have been turned into Avoxes as well. With all this guilt that she feels, she apologizes to Lavinia. But Lavinia is kind and indicates by gesture that Katniss didn't need to be sorry, and there was nothing that she could have done to save her. It's extremely disheartening to see how Lavinia's voice has been taken from her as a young woman. Lavinia would end up dying a horrible death as a result of Katniss rebelling. She was electrocuted to death. The next Avox we hear of is Pollux. Pollux was turned into an Avox by the capital as well, and as a result, he was subsequently forced to work in the city's underground transfer tunnels. His brother, Castor, eventually bought Pollux's way to be able to work above ground after 5 long years. As a result of his liberation, Pollux began to eventually work as a cameraman and would eventually be part of the camera crew that Katniss would end up using in Mockingjay Part 1. Pollux cannot speak anymore, but the interesting thing about him is that he could whistle. And despite his now disability, he still whistles to the Mockingjays and waits for them to sing in return. We don't know too much about his previous history, but through him we see the working conditions of the civil servant Avoxes. And now we know that a person could at least buy their way for an Avox to work above ground. Unfortunately, a lot of other Avoxes were not as lucky. The final Avox that we're aware of is Darius. Darius was actually a former District 12 peacekeeper. He was one of the few peacekeepers that was actually somewhat flirty and kind and friendly to Katniss before he was taken. He makes a lot of jokes with Katniss, and Katniss herself says as far as peacekeepers go, Darius was the one that she actually could respect. In Catching Fire, however, in chapter 8, we see him trying to stand up for another citizen, Gale. When Gale was being whipped by Romulus Thread, Darius tried to stand in for him, but Romulus hit him in the head and he was knocked unconscious. He was struck in the head with the butt of the whip that was used. Thanks to Haymitch and Peeta stepping in, Gale's whippings were ended, but unfortunately, other peacekeepers came and lifted Darius by his arms and legs and took him back to the base. Unfortunately, what we wouldn't know is that for him trying to stand up for Gale, in chapter 15 of Catching Fire, we find out that he was actually taken and was made into an Avox. And alongside Lavinia, he was forced to serve District 12 tributes as well in the training center. Darius was clearly placed to serve Katniss and Peeta as a clear warning from the capital. And just as Katniss saw it, I definitely believe that President Snow made sure that Darius would serve the District 12 tribute specifically to try and frighten and threaten Katniss. Unfortunately for Darius, his death was even more gruesome than Lavinia's. The guards beat him, dismantled him, cut off his body parts, and questioned him. But because he was an Avox, he couldn't really answer. Peeta states that he could only make horrible animal sounds as they tortured him, and it took days of beatings and mutilations until he died. Because The Hunger Games is a sort of reflection or critique on how the real world works, the unfortunate part is that things like this happen to people every day. There are many oppressive regimes in which people are trafficked and enslaved and taken against their will for crimes against that same oppressive regime. Let us not forget that Finnick was one of the first people we were aware of that was trafficked as a young child amongst the capital, and he had no choice as he was forced to. Otherwise, his family would have been killed by President Snow. And in a regime that could kill children for entertainment and sport, it's not unthinkable or unfathomable that they could traffic children as well. The unfortunate part is there were many other victims besides Finnick Odair that never had their opportunity to come to light. And even when you're a victor of the capital, you never truly have any victory, because the capital will always find some way to torture you, to put you down, to have you under their control. The Hunger Games was never about winning. It was about survival. And even then, you were still the capital's plaything. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I think for the next video, I'll be doing something a little bit more lighthearted, because this was a lot to have to research because of just how graphic this whole situation is. But thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. In the next video, I wanted to talk about how District 11 is definitely the Black District, because rereading the books, I'm realizing a pattern within District 11 and it needs to be talked about. So hopefully that would be a little bit more entertaining, and I will see you guys in the next video. Okay, bye.